So if the first primary purpose is around technical advice, the second one is around fundraising. The idea there being that you leverage the personal influence of board members to be able to raise funds for the organization. Sometimes that's direct, so you seek out high net worth individuals to join the board. Sometimes it's because of the organizations they belong to, philanthropies say, and sometimes it's because of the network that they have. But the emphasis there is really more on external communications and advocacy, given the need to communicate key messages effectively and consistently. Now, on the other hand, a third primary purpose of boards can be to help sort of elevate the profile of the organization or provide the organization with legitimacy. So here, the primary purpose is to gain visibility and credibility through individuals that provide personal influence or professional influence through the organizations that they belong to. And here, again, sort of similar to the second purpose, you want to emphasize external communications and advocacy to help raise the organization's profile. Again, this has implications for the types of board members you want to seek out. Now, boards can accomplish all three of these things, but the reason we're bringing this up is because thinking about what you want the primary purpose of your board can be can help a lot as you're thinking through board member selection. Now, I mentioned a few slides ago the importance of setting expectations with board members. Attendance norms are rules just related to maximum meeting absences, say. So we've seen organizations that say if a board member misses 2 consecutive meetings that they'll be removed. Other boards have more relaxed attendance norms, but being conscious about that helps to set expectations right. If you don't set expectations around attendance norms, you can start to see board member conflict occurring when board members who are vigilant about attending get frustrated with board members who are more opportunistic with the meetings that they attend. So making sure that you're clear in setting these norms can help to allay some of that conflict. Tenure is another one. Is there, do you have terms for board members? In general, I think our belief is that that's good practice for several reasons. One is it enables you to roll off board members that may be less engaged, less effective, or that may be creating difficult dynamics within the board in a way that does so with grace and with existing processes. But it's also just good as a process to be able to bring in new blood and refresh the board. Now, that said, I think in general, we also believe that having terms that are renewable is a good compromise solution. So that if you have board members that are particularly committed to the organization or important, that you don't lose out of them through term limits. And then having alternates is something that a lot of effective organizations do. Have policies to be able to designate either individuals or organizations when someone is unable to attend a meeting, say. This can allow for flexibility within the board and also can potentially increase the range of voices that you hear from. So just being conscious about these different policies can help to set you up for success. Now, in order to get the most out of board, though, you do need to make investments. And so all of those benefits that I mentioned at the start do require some care and feeding to keep your board active and engaged. One thing that we recommend is for executive directors or CEOs to have conversations with each board member prior to major meetings, so that insofar as there are major decisions that are coming up, you've generated buy-in and also to understand the concerns and needs of individual board members so that when the meeting actually happens, you're able to address those head on. In general, we think that being able to identify what unique value each board member is able to bring to the organization and to carve out a role that allows them to do that allows you to, number one, make sure that you're getting the most out of your board members and makes them feel heard and understood. And it helps them to know that their value is being recognized. Third point here is around identifying and planning for event opportunities. Here, this is where being able to include boards at speaking events, say, where the organization prepares talking points and provides them with what they need, can help to elevate your profile. I think this is particularly important for that third purpose of the board, where it's helping to generate credibility or increase visibility of you as an organization. Many social enterprises and nonprofits that we speak with have dedicated staff members, at least one, whose partial or full responsibility is to provide board engagement, provide board communications, help to do all the logistics related to board meetings, Often these folks will provide opportunities for various team members of the organization to give sort of roadshow presentations to be able to showcase the work that they're doing. And I think it's our sense that this is the investment that you need to make in terms of having staff whose role includes board engagement in order to get the full return on a board. Being able to schedule meetings in advance and stick to that is particularly important, especially when you have high profile members of your board. That just helps with attendance hugely. And then in general, sending meetings in advance to allow board members to digest is a sort of an obvious thing that is a good practice in order to get the most. So that's the sort of how to service a well-functioning board, but we're fully aware that when thinking through effective boards, there are various ways that boards can fall into pathways of dysfunction. So one would be a rubber stamp board, one that just approves whatever management proposes, plays the role of cheerleader. These boards, rubber stamp boards, tend to be found with organizations run by charismatic chief executives who value their autonomy. And assemble boards with the expectation that its members are compliant or to reassure external stakeholders. We'd encourage you, even if you are charismatic, to find folks that do come from different backgrounds or will be willing to challenge your thinking or your strategy to the point that I raised earlier. That way you can really make sure that you are both taking that long-term view, being mindful of risks at hand, and really making sure that your direction of travel is one that will be able to stand the test of time. On the flip side of the rubber stamp board is the micromanaging board, one that effectively tries to take on key management functions in addition to its governance role. Now, the risk here is that the staff feel disempowered or become passive in the face of repeated intrusions into what they expect would be their areas of authority. One way to think about solving for this is to think about committee structures and really clearly outlining what the interface between specific staff members and specific board members can be. The third form of dysfunction that we'll cover today are balkanized boards, ones that are composed of people who are concerned with only one part of the organization, often the program that they support financially. Now, the danger here is that because they don't see how all of the pieces of the organization fit together, it means that chief executives are left to do that stitching. And this can also be dangerous if an organization's revenues shrink and priorities have to be reevaluated. So if these are different forms of dysfunction, what we wanted to do is provide a few sort of early warning signs that can allow you to spot areas of dysfunction so that you can get ahead of it and address it. So again, maybe building on that point around the balkanized board, one thing to be alert to is misplaced loyalty, where the board directors care about one aspect of the organization, say. Because board directors' first and highest loyalty should be to the organization and to its mission. And so, the thing to clarify in terms of board expectations is that even if they care about an organization for a specific program that it has, say, board members have an obligation to advocate for the organization's best interests as a whole. Again, coming back to the micromanaging board, if you see that, well, actually, one thing I should preface this and say is that board members who are volunteering to work alongside staff can be really effective. That can help to amplify an organization's work and also gain a deeper understanding of the organization. So the warning sign is when the board members are directly making asks of the staff as opposed to working through the board meetings to make requests, say, or making decisions on the staff's behalf, or providing negative evaluations of employees based on potentially brief glimpses of their work. This can create a toxic environment, can lead to team members becoming passive or demoralized. So I think the key is that to emphasize that when they are reaching out to work with staff, they should realize that they're volunteers who happen to be board members, rather than board members there to supervise anyone. So their role is to help advise and learn. So that's one way to think about the micromanaging board. In terms of unexamined performance, I mean, board members should be open to and actively engage in the process of assembling feedback for the executives, say, or whoever they are responsible for assessing as a part of the organization. Now, here, another aspect about examiner performance has to do with board members themselves, and undiscussed differences of opinion between board members can actually turn into deep resentments that can trigger a crisis or drive people away. The way to prevent this is through regular feedback and candid communication. This could be, say, to form a small group composed of the board chairperson, the CEO, the general counsel, or the chair of the governance committee, and to meet every 6 to 12 months to both assess board member performance and assign a representative to provide feedback. We'll get into the topic of conflict a little bit later on in the session as well. Now, when it comes to dissent, another warning sign is if board members seem to be suppressing it. Board members should be welcoming minority views and encourage skepticism to avoid groupthink, to avoid the rubber stamping board that we mentioned. So we encourage you to create a tone where minority views and skepticism are welcomed around the board table, with all members encouraged to speak their minds and vote their consciences, even if that creates tension. Tension over content is okay, and that can be resolved. Passionate debate, non-unanimous votes are actually signals of strong, not weak governing bodies, as long as the conflict stays at the content level and doesn't turn personal. When it comes to the personal, board members should have zero tolerance for unprofessional and unethical behavior in and outside the boardroom, and that should be addressed directly. And again, so accepting balkanization is a warning sign here. So the key is to spot when balkanization is happening, as the last point on this slide. Again, board directors should embrace all parts of the organization and not just isolate themselves to overseeing the parts in which they have special interest or expertise. One of the most common ways that I've seen this in my experience working with organizations is regionalism. That say someone that joins and is really interested in a given program in a given country will only focus on working, and interacting with that country team rather than understanding the full benefits of what the organization is doing. This is where those road shows that I mentioned a few minutes ago, to be able to showcase other aspects of the organization, can be particularly valuable in helping board members to see the full picture. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Naoko to talk about how to think about diversity on boards.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And yeah, I guess we just continue on presenting quickly. Great. And so that, as Matt said, I will be speaking about the value of having a diverse board and providing some tips around how to do that. So starting with why you want to have a diverse members in your board. And what's the benefit about it? I have 3 examples here, the 3 reasons why a diverse board can add value to your organization. And then there should be more, but going through some of these examples. First one is the improved decision-making. As you can see in the first quote, a board composed of directors representing a range of perspectives and identities leads to an environment of a collaborative tension that is the essence of the good governance. And in a room where everyone has a different point of view, and there is a great opportunity for cross-pollination of ideas, and there are fewer unspoken assumptions, and then that would be a less groupthink and a greater likelihood of innovation and creativities. And this allows the board to ask the probing questions and tackle the challenging issues such as the risk management and successful planning, which is a really center of the good corporate governance. So that's number 1. Number 2 reason, better stakeholder insight. And this happens particularly when you have the representation from the community you want to serve or you want to work with in the board members. So here's another quote. A diverse board of directors can bring a realistic view of the community, strengthen the organization's connection and credibility to its constituency, apologize for pronunciation, and then improve fundraising and assist with grants distribution. In essence, this makes the group more effective at carrying out its mission. So diverse board of director can bring a realistic view of the community and strengthen really the connection, credibility, which then help the fundraising and the value of the organization. That's number two. And number three would be a true commitment to diversity and inclusion. As the board becomes more diverse, it will only create more inclusive companies, so that trickles down and create the virtuous cycle. A diverse board that is sensitive to cultural difference also is better able to attract and retain a diverse membership, workforce, and the pipeline of future directors. So those are the top line reasons why a diverse set of a board would be important and beneficial for your organization. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then so then moving on to, so how to do that. And I'm talking about this with the conscious humbleness that Dalberg still hasn't completely cracked it, and we are also working on it. But here are the 6 lessons we learned internally as well as in serving as an organization. Tip number 1 would be address bias. So unconscious bias can shape all aspects of the hiring and recruiting process, then shaping the organizational climate and the staff and board retention. Checking a privilege is the step towards building a more inclusive team. And to do so, you can also consider conducting unconscious bias training, especially for those in charge of the hiring, recruiting of the board members, but across the organizations. Tip number 2, involve all team members in fostering diversity. And this refers back to what Matt was saying, that it's important like having a staff member who engages the board, and hence the value and the retention of the board members. It is true for diversity reason as well. So fostering diversity takes sustained and internal intentional action. And yeah, it's just impossible to just do that at the board level. It has to be across the organization. So within the organization, everyone should know that recruiting all different types of people is a priority for the organization. And this applies to staff, management, and the board. Tip number 3 would be proactive in recruiting and intentional in recruiting, and go outside of a usual suspect channel. To build a diverse boardroom, we have to go beyond the traditional networks that have populated the current or past boardrooms. And that could include, but not limited to, exploring digital tools that you might be already doing it, but that can reach the wider audience than going through the typical agencies that you might have used before. Consider partnering with other organizations with your community, such as local colleges, university, community groups, or chamber of commerce, to identify and recruit potential candidates from among those that are who are likely to understand the needs and the perspective of people you're serving. And something to remember is that people tend to know people like them. So refer that from the type of people that you want to retain, and ask that person to refer. That is the really great way to recruit someone that you want to target. Tip number 4, make diversity a part of your mission. So make your mission accessible and resonant for more diverse population, and make it clear in your outreach, make it clear in your job posting. And expanding a definition of a diversity beyond the typical gender or racial background, nationality, but going beyond such as religion, sexual orientation, and other factor. And again, make it clear in your outreach. The tip number 5, set the clear DEI diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, and sort of set the goal and a target. Having a clearly defined strategy will enhance your organization's chance for success, and develop a comprehensive plan that include the concrete goals, objectives, and tasks to achieve that. Set the time frame for meeting those goals, and define how the organization will measure the success along the way is also important, not just in your business commercial way, but also how you build the diversity. This can include a specific matrix such as the recruitment and a retention rate of the target population, and a more qualitative measure such as the board survey and annual board assessment, and also exit interviews, which can include feedback. Having a defined DEI strategy will demonstrate the organization's commitment to a nonprofit board diversity and make leadership more accountable and provide a roadmap for those responsible for executing that strategy and aiming to achieve the goal. And the last tip number 6 is the create a boardroom that supports diverse members. So don't stop just by hiring. Once you have the diverse member, you want to make sure that you get best out of them and you retain them. So this starts by making the boardroom an environment conducive to diversity. It is really important to remember that building the diverse board is not about the tokenism. It's not just about your face on your website. No board member wants to fill the quota, and no one is able to represent an entire subsection of the population either. So you must treat each board member equally and expect the same from everyone. Organizations are often more successful integrating new voices when the new group makes up 30% of the total, or at the minimum in a small environment like a boardroom, 3 people. This helps change the culture, and the new participant will not feel isolated. And to better integrate new members, incorporate informal social time and the training on diversity and inclusiveness and awareness training into board meetings. Also consider whether your board and organization will benefit from cultural competency training. So those are our 6 tips that we can share from our experience. And I think there's one more slide. Yes. So talking about diversity, you might think about more around gender, demography, it is sort of demographic background as such. But another element that is becoming increasingly important to many companies is the geographic diversity. And I wanted to touch briefly on that. As the board strives to improve the organization and the board effectiveness in engaging all the stakeholders, and in order to understand and manage both risks and opportunities effectively, geographic diversity in the boardroom will need to increase. And creating sustained and effective global board so that the board across the globe must include a focus on the processes to facilitate that. So things that we can recommend and on how include so the board meeting can be scheduled for times in which members across the globe can attend. No one wants to attend the 11 p.m. board meeting every month. Board meetings can be located outside of where the headquarters are to give a board directors. Sorry, I think it's something's missing here. I come back to that. And in a board, the meeting materials can be prepared with the cultural sensitivity to processes and the languages that is important to accommodate for potential confusion that can occur due to the differences in a business languages, jargon, or cultural context that simply do not translate cross-culturally. And again, at the Dalberg, this is also still a learning process. And however, we are very much aware that this is something we need to tackle consciously to build the diverse organization. I think this is the end of the diversity in the board section.
Yeah, thanks so much, Yako. Happy to take it over. Before we jump into the slides on managing conflict, though, I think it's worth just recognizing. So I'm guessing many of you do not pay your board members, right? So lots of the literature around effective boards, focus on corporate boards where people are getting paid, and there's a quid pro quo, right? You're sort of participating, you're engaging, bringing your expertise, but you're getting paid. In the nonprofit world and the social enterprise world, more frequently, of course, our board members are volunteers. And we may have mechanisms for thinking about volunteers more broadly in our organization, but we don't always think about the dynamics around our boards as related to the dynamics that other volunteers may be facing. So just to acknowledge, I think coming at the topic of managing conflict, I'll wear 3 hats as I share this content. One is, as an advisor, frequently boards are an audience for our work, right? So we're doing strategy work and the board will provide input to a strategy process, and they'll also be part of the audience that approves the new direction. So as an advisor, I think of how we interface with boards. I also sit on a couple of boards, so I can share a perspective as a board member. But in my role just prior to Dalberg, I was sitting inside of a multinational eyeglasses company, and I oversaw all of our corporate philanthropy. And I had 2 boards that I had to answer to, more from the perspective of an executive director. So doing the board meeting preparations and facilitating the session. So as you think about kind of each of those ways of engaging, I would just invite you, as you think about conflict, to try to put yourself in those different shoes to untangle whatever conflict you might be seeing, because reconciling conflict is never easy, and especially when people are giving you their time, treasure, and talent, right? The 3 things we usually hope for from a board. This can be especially delicate, right? So I would say maybe we'll just start by naming a couple different kinds of conflict, because if you can diagnose the root cause of the conflict, you'll be more likely to be able to resolve it. So as we go to the next slide, the first kind of conflict I will speak to is relationship conflict. Maybe this is the hardest to resolve. And I won't say that diversity leads to this, but to the extent that you are intentionally trying to bring in people who don't look at things the same way, you can expect, in the spirit of seeing them differently, that people might disagree, right? And to Matt's earlier point, that culture of constructive disagreement is so important. But frequently, I think relationship conflict is actually just a function of people not knowing each other very well, not appreciating why that divergence of opinion might be emerging. So it may be also related to strong emotions if there's a particularly sensitive topic, but I think relationship conflict, can be, we'll talk about different ways to address, but can be addressed by simply ensuring people know each other, know their backstories, know why they're on the board, from a kind of personal motivation perspective. The second kind of conflict is data conflict. If people are not working from the same fact base, it would be easy to draw different conclusions. So if there's a lack of information or misinformation or different interpretation of data, then you run this risk of people sort of engaging with the content you're sharing and drawing different conclusions, and that leading to conflict. This point around interest conflict, maybe because there's really a perception that, in fact, interests are not always aligned. Maybe there's a trade-off that people are expecting to see in terms of maintaining a friendly relationship. So if someone has an interest in something landing one way, not necessarily strictly conflict of interest things, but other kinds of interests, that can lead to tension, right, when those interests diverge. Structural conflict, I think, is really one that can boil down to kind of issues of authority or power. So for example, if there's a perceived inequity in the process of electing a board chair, right, or the process you put in place around committee structure and committee chairs, rotating people between committees, there may be divergence there in terms of, a sense that things are not fair in a structural way. And last is really the risk of values conflict. And this just, of course, just comes down to sort of how people see the world. And again, when you choose diversity, you are choosing people with a range of perspectives. They see the world in lots of different ways, and that's constructive. But when the distinction, when the difference goes to kind of the heart of the organization, its work, its mission, what it stands for, it can be much harder to reconcile. But critical to reconcile, right? Because you can set up rules around values sometimes, but not always, right? Sometimes this is a matter of interpretation. So thinking about those kinds of conflict, then we can turn to what might be ways to address this. And I'd say there's a couple that we've touched on that are more in the preventive category, and some that are more in the active category. Matt made a number of comments around structuring a board, clarifying roles and responsibilities, as all being critical to aligning expectations, right? And those aligned expectations should go a long way in helping people avoid conflict, to the extent that those are well understood. I would say that structurally, though, having a board chair is an important element here. Lifting the responsibility for interpersonal conflict or other kinds of conflict on the board out of the responsibility of the executive director and onto the board chair creates more neutrality, right? And allows the executive director to stick with the day job of running the organization, and can offload some of that responsibility to the board chair. So hopefully this, effectiveness in this role, can go a long ways in terms of understanding the importance of process, different facilitation techniques, mostly again in prevention, but this would be an important tool in the toolkit if you were looking to really manage a conflict actively. I'd say another element just in the prevention side is really having a board reflection process. So an annual board self-evaluation, right? Where the board can really answer the questions of, do we feel like we're working together in an effective way? That process should yield input from the executive director, from senior staff to say, yes, we feel like we're getting what we're needing from the board. Or it would be, an effective mechanism for surfacing areas where, in fact, the board needs to pay more attention. So that's certainly prevention. Structured procedures is also prevention. So being able to, again, the formality of these procedures, can vary widely, whether you are a large organization or a small organization. Some kind of a, grievance procedure, right? Sort of a way of flagging whether there is conflict, if someone feels a lack of fairness. Frequently, a typical grievance procedure will actually lay out the steps of how something gets resolved, and it will name who should be involved. You might see this typically in like the risk management committee, right, where there would be an escalation process, and if something is registered again in a kind of a formal way, then a whole process kicks off, and it's very transparent who's involved and why and what those steps are. So that can be, again, a quite formal way of tackling conflict. Maybe less formal, maybe more powerful though, is even thinking about things like a code of conduct for your directors, right? And making some of the norm setting very explicit in terms of those expectations, the rules for relationships with each other, with the executive director, with staff. Just laying that out is frequently enough, actually, in terms of helping people manage their relationships with one another. But certainly at the end of the day, if prevention doesn't work, having the skills and the space to address conflicts effectively is critical. I'd say, there's a lot of premium put on, being quite open, being, willing to acknowledge where the conflict sits, being able to talk about what we'll do as a board when we have differences, other than just vote, right? Like, ultimately boards will vote on things and a decision will be made and it will go forward. That's an awfully blunt instrument though, right? When it comes to some of these conflicts, especially those conflicts that are more personal or interpersonal in terms of values or relationships. Having, time for that interpersonal experience is critical, whether that's kind of orientation. So one board I'm a part of has at the beginning of every 5-year cycle, there's a full weekend. It's a very technical organization. And in fact, making sure that everyone understands the details of the organization is critical for the board to be able to do its job. The board includes lots of people who are not technical necessarily. So again, it's a little bit about fact-based, but having a whole weekend together means you have time for breakfasts and dinners to build those relationships, understand people's lives outside of this time they spend each quarter on the board itself. I think when there is conflict and you're trying to work through it, coming back to any kind of negotiation skills can be helpful, but I think also anchoring on the impact the organization wants to achieve can cut through some of the noise that comes up when they're more interpersonal oriented conflicts. Looking for win-win for the organization and its constituents, as opposed to win-win like between two board members, right? So sort of turning turning the subject matter back to the reason that everyone is engaged. I think there's frequently a lot of hard work that boards take on, and being able to celebrate successes goes a long ways to building the muscles to then deal with challenges. I was part of a CEO transition with a board that I was a part of, and it was very tough. You know, we hired the new CEO. It didn't work out. We had to fire that CEO and then decide whether the staff person who'd been the interim would be the right person to step in. It was not easy, right? And so being able to celebrate the successes is another way to build up that goodwill, really, that helps you get through some of the harder times. And then I'd say, it would be remiss, especially as we talk about diversity, to not acknowledge that, it's well known that from a gender perspective or a cultural perspective, the approaches to dealing with conflict can vary widely. And so that sensitivity, to Naoko's point, as it relates to diversity training, is important to build and to name and to put out there as part of the reconciliation process. Ultimately, it may be that a third party is helpful. Again, if you have a kind of formal grievance type of process, it might name when a mediator, an outside mediator, might step in. This doesn't have to be an outside mediator. This could be a former board chair, right, who sort of comes back in and sort of brings important contextual understanding of the organization and the board, but is removed from the day-to-day board operations. So you can think of even board alumni as folks who could be really relevant to helping work through a challenging moment. So those are a few thoughts on reconciling, although we know that this is not an easy path. And again, when you've got folks who are predominantly volunteering, being able to engage them and reconcile those differences in a way that makes them want to come back to the next meeting is essential. There are times though that someone may realize, in fact, that they're maybe not suited for the board, and they may choose to part ways. And I think being able as a board to talk about a situation where that happens is also very healthy. And again, in the spirit of tackling conflict in ways that are very open, to the extent that that's even on the table, I would say, as an executive director, it's important to talk to the board chair about how to acknowledge that, what kind of conversation should happen, if that's desirable, if that's not desirable, what might the organization or the board members want to do to try to retain that person. Because that, certainly there's, to Matt's point, if you have term limits, I mean, there's turnover, there are practices about bringing people on. Likewise, there should be, intentionality as people roll off, even if it's off cycle. So we've just talked for a long time. We were asked to share some foundational perspectives with you all, and so we have. But Matt, I'm wondering if I'd love to, sort of pose some questions. I haven't been able to monitor the chat as well, but wondered if folks want to come off mute and maybe share a little bit with us, where have you found struggle, or come off mute and pose a question. Again, I know there are some in the chat, so we can look back through these, but would love to hear from folks. Colin, I see a hand, you're quick. All right, what you got?
Thanks for that. That was a really good presentation. Thanks. And big fan of Dalberg, good friend of Edwin Masha here and a few others. And so here's a question. I don't think we're I think there are many other organizations like us. We're a not-for-profit social enterprise, $12 million turnover, so relatively small, but we're working in Africa, we're working in India, South America. We raise our money in the States. We raise our money in Europe. We've got boards. We've got 6 boards right across the world. So that model, I don't think you've addressed in what you've presented. And I imagine it's not uncommon. Where we found, not particularly conflict, we work to get the if you say, the synergies out of that. But remember, we've got big egos, sometimes household names, big talent right across the world. What, as somebody said to us, what happens tomorrow if something goes wrong? Who does the journalist ring? Who's the global governance person? And we're trying to deal with that. But I think that's not an uncommon scenario for small organizations. But by the way, a lot of management time goes into managing each one of those boards and each one of those egos. Great, great, great value, undoubtedly. But that model, I don't think you've dealt with that. And like I say, it's probably something that there must be best practice out there somewhere.
I'm happy to speak to that. You're absolutely right. And one element that makes that even more complicated is a situation where the statutory requirements in a given country are different. So the roles of the board and the required composition actually aren't like for like. And that can create a lot of uncertainty about ultimate authority and perception of different parts of the organization getting more support versus less. To my mind, one of the most essential things to clarify when you have a model like that is to be really clear about the interface among those boards. And so you have to make a call on whether, for instance, the global board sits above those country level boards and has ultimate decision-making authority, and then defining how dispute mechanisms would work to run things up to the global board, for instance. Or if you want it to be more like a sort of federated model among the boards, then you have some kind of memo of understanding to be able to manage risk in a way that makes sense. But where trouble comes in my experience is when there isn't that clarity about the relationship among the boards. And it gets even more complicated if you allow for dual membership, for instance, so that you have someone both on a global board and on a country level board. So defining what dual membership means, what the criteria are for that. In general, I think it's safe to say that best practice is that dual membership is only available to people who sort of pass the nominating criteria that the global board already uses, say. The other thing to bear in mind when you have a situation like this is again, setting expectations in terms of roles related to the interface that those various boards will have with staff. And coming back to the point around balkanization, I do think that even though regional boards' mandate is usually or statutorily about the operations in that country, still being able to find opportunities for those regional boards to connect with the wider governance ecosystem for the organization can help to sort of remind everyone about the broader mission. So let me pause there and see if Colin, that's at least starts to get at the question, because I agree, it can become very complicated very quickly in those scenarios.
No, thanks, Matt. I think there's work to do in this area, though. I think there's some best practice pieces that, because there's all sorts of other scenarios that can emerge. But no, thanks for that, Matt. That's really useful.
Great. Paul, I see you've got a hand up, and there's also a question from Michael in the chat. Paul, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll turn to Michael's question.
All right, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks for the presentations I've been giving so far. For a small business, trying to tap into some corporate governance opportunities and hopefully raise funding for the business through setting up a board, has been alluded to by one of the presenters so far. I'm wondering, how do you get a board that's not invested in the business to work with some kind of performance metrics, setting up some targets, structure for the board to work with. They're not invested, they don't have any kind of ownership in the business, they're just volunteers. We don't even have a clear reward mechanism. Okay, so we say we have a certain percentage of net profits that will be shared, as some kind of reward to the boards if we make a profit, right? So how do you get a board that is that loosely connected to the business to even take certain, actions to respond to performance requirements?
Yeah, and so I'm happy to take this one, and then I'll make more space for other questions from my colleagues. But it's a great one. Yeah, I mean, the question is, how do you provide the right set of incentives? And this is where I think it becomes. I mean, this comes back to Laura's point around having volunteer board members. So what is it that keeps them involved? Here, I think it's alignment and passion around the mission of the organization is particularly important, and so making sure that there is some kind of incentive in terms of like-mindedness, in terms of the what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, And if you learn that a board member doesn't have that, then you're absolutely right that having them, getting them incentivized to be able to help you becomes more challenging. Though I do think, coming back to one of the first things I was talking about, being really clear about what the role of the board is meant to be and what expectations of individual board members are, and clarifying when you are in the process of selecting board members, in those conversations, that those board members are happy to take on those responsibilities and understand what they are, can help to sort of prevent some of this, but not all of it. And sometimes there's drift, right? Sometimes there are board members who start off very engaged, and over time, either for personal or professional reasons, sort of start to peel away. That's another reason why having set terms that are potentially renewable can become a good way to keep freshness on the board.
Yeah, and I can add to that, while you can't necessarily pay them, if you're growing a small business, to the extent you can take them on a trip, sort of do other things, right? Like sort of find other ways to give something back to them, even though it's not shares in the company or a strict monetary exchange. Hosting the next board meeting, it may be in proximity to the communities that your business is serving, even though that will require some travel. Again, that is a double-edged sword for some people. Some people will love the opportunity to travel. Others will say, oh gosh, now you want me to travel? So, but finding out, sort of what that appetite is for. Again, the opportunity to travel, I'd say, is a great tool for building and deepening the relationships between board members, in addition to having them better understand the work you're doing. So if that would be seen as a plus, then I'd say that's a way that you can invest in that board and those members without paying them per se.
And I'll jump in here with Daphne's question. She's not able to actually come off mute. She put this in earlier about, for their board criteria, they originally had everyone that's on the board has to contribute financially. No minimum amount, but that's how that helped them grow early on. But they have had members who haven't been turned away or didn't feel comfortable with that. And her question, Daphne, is like, what's your take on this? They're 15 years old now. Should this be a change? Should this not be required? Some insights.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then colleagues, please build. But I think explaining why it's important is sort of the first thing. I've been part of boards where everyone is expected to give, but it's because when the organization is fundraising from other entities, frequently those funders will ask, does your entire board support your mission financially? And again, the amount is not important. And so being able to say, it's $25 minimum, really like set the floor very low, so that they can say, yes, our board is supporting us in its entirety, unlocks then this broader opportunity for funds. So the clarity around why, I think, is important. I think also being open, there is a point certainly in the maturity of some organizations where, in the balance of time, treasure, and talent, the board's treasure is less important, as organizations grow and have more formalized fundraising teams. But, if they're not giving money, there's sort of the give or get, paradigm, right? So even if it's a fundraising board and you're not in a position to write big checks, then you support the organization in reaching out maybe to your network that would be able to. So introducing the concept of give or get is another one that I see some boards using. But Noko, Matt, anything you'd add on that one?
No, not on that particular one, just conscious of the time, just I can pick on unless there's an audience raising hands, I can also move on to a few other questions in the thread. And I think there was one question on the small organization where the funder CEO also sits on the board. And how do you manage this clear distinction? And I think I have been on one. I was not an executive role, but I was on a board, and MD, managing director, also sits on the board. And he was very self-aware of a potential conflict of interest on he wasn't the chair of the board, of course, but it's just really going back to the basics of a clear roles and responsibility written down on a paper. I think that's important. Another thing is to keep in mind is probably because the data coming to the board review and sign off often prepared and reviewed by the MD. So potentially consider maybe not an audit, but a second eye review of first of all, what kind of data should go to the board discussion, and as well as how the data is prepared.
Thanks, Naoko. You know, I maybe two things to that. One is I think it's not uncommon for an executive director to be a board member, ideally a non-voting board member though, right? I mean, the reason the ED should be in those conversations is so that they're able to hear the dialogue firsthand, right? Because it will have such import for the work. But making yourself a non-voting member starts to avoid some of that conflict. Also setting up the practice of executive session where the board meets without that executive director member and without any of the senior staff in the room. Again, is an important chance, and it can be that the board chair is then, you know, if the executive director has something on her mind, she can tell the board chair, and the board chair can lead that executive session of the board where you don't have any of that staff and you don't have that executive director in the room. So it doesn't preclude the topics of the day from being debated, but it does create a space where if there is any tension or concern about performance or about priorities, the board has a safe space to debate that just among themselves. So I think those two things become especially important when the executive director is a member of the board, which again I think is fine practice and quite common in the nonprofit world. Other questions that folks have? I'm not seeing any others.
Or experiences that you think are particularly valuable to share too.
Yeah, other tips.
Yeah, I'll give you one tip. It seems a bit banal, but it's called What's Up, and doesn't work in the States, by the way, very well. But across, we found actually by just using WhatsApp groups for all of our boards, we're able to send them photos or short video of our work, and they're able to use that as currency themselves for their families or their contacts. It's an amazing way to keep people together. Actually look for feedback. I also have a friend, she runs a post-conflict organization. She has ex-presidents on her WhatsApp group, ministers of interior from Colombia to Syria. When she used to write an email to everybody and say, what do you think about X? She gets zero response. She writes a WhatsApp about X policy that's just come out. Her inbox is full within an hour. And it's a really good way to consult sporadically and at the right level in an informal way with your board members or your advisors or whatever.
I think that's a great point, and really sort of underscores a point that I made earlier, but maybe it's worth really mentioning it again, which is the easier you can make it for board members to connect with the vividness of the work that you're doing, the more, to Paul's question, the more engaged and incentivized they'll be. And so insofar as you can use technology for quick hits, you don't need to wait until some long report is written. The board members may or may not read that, but quick hits with photos and videos that show your organization in action. The barriers to that now are so much lower than they were even 5 or 10 years ago, and you can use that to great effect.
I'll say I'm an alumni board member of a group that I get an email every Friday. Here are the 2 LinkedIn posts we hope you'll post, right? Like, so I asked them, right, how can I amplify your work if I'm not on the board any longer? And they're like, we'd love if you'd push this out to your social network. I'm like, well, great. You just tell me what you wanted to say, right? So you take all of the ambiguity out of it, and I can do that, and and do it happily, really. I wonder, because diversity was an important part of today's conversation, do folks have recommendations on how you've recruited a range of experiences and backgrounds to your boards, other things that you would lift up for the group to take away from today. Any questions that folks would like to pose to us? We're going to turn in a moment to a poll, because today, I think as many of you know, is the first of two-part discussion. Oh, Karen, please.
Yeah, just 3 quick questions. And I'm sorry, you might have already answered this because I was 10 minutes late. So my first question is, can we get a recording or some of the materials from the presentation? Okay, that would be fantastic. And I don't know if this was covered before, but is there a statistic on percentages of give or get from board members, like of strong and healthy organizations, and what the percentage is that board members raise or donate?
I'm sure that there's some kind of benchmark data, but that's going to be, I think that will be hugely sort of baselined against what the overall size of the organization is.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. And I guess my other question is that I find it to be somewhat a somewhat challenging balance between sometimes the amount of information and time that boards would like, even in terms of preparing information, and sort of like because I see time as money, right? So if we spend a long time preparing something that you think will be helpful in terms of an analysis of this or this or that, and the board isn't raising money that corresponds with that time, I find that to be a little bit challenging. So I'm just trying to see if you have any advice for, possible conversations for when it feels like it can be quite a bit of staff time for board interests in providing information.
Yeah, it's interesting. That raises a point that I didn't bring up when I was talking about the primary purpose of the board. But where what you're describing is something where I've seen that is where you have some board members who are primarily about raising the profile or fundraising, but you have other board members that are more on the technical assistance side of things and are often more junior because that their expertise is closer to the work. So one of the things, Karen, that we talked about right at the beginning is just being clear about the primary purpose of the board and what the asks are. If you have a mix of both, oftentimes the latter group, the technical folks, want to get much more involved in the details and can take a lot of care in feeding. If that isn't useful, then it may be worth thinking about the composition and maybe reorienting the board members towards more of a development focused board, because that way you're getting, that's what you recognize you need from the governance body.
Okay. And you think it's completely fair to just say, hey, what we really need is we need development?
I think setting expectations as you're interviewing potential board members and then clarifying what their roles are is a no-brainer. Yep.
And I would say transitioning from a board that may be more programmatic or technical advice to a board that's more of a fundraising board, is probably something that will take some time. So I think you can't ask the same board members to kind of sign up under a different set of expectations. You can hope that they'll stay and you can hope that they would be effective under that. But I think that's a strategic shift in the governance. You could think about an advisory body that is more a fundraising body if you still feel like you need the programmatic or technical expertise, right? And then you can sort of try to bring in some heavy hitters who really care about the cause but don't care about the governance. They'd be happy to raise money, but they actually don't want to sit through quarterly meetings. So there's other structures that might help you tap into that in ways that would be less disruptive to the board you have if the board you have is also valuable. Last thought on that is just, can you distinguish between the sort of like the must-have materials versus the nice-to-have materials, and sort of say, hey, like for this board meeting, you all need to read these 2 documents. Some of you are going to want to read these 5, and if you do, here they are. They're on our website, and you can say we wrote them for other audiences, but we think you might find them interesting. So you're not creating new material to help the board go deep. Sort of just point them to other stuff that you're putting out anyway. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both.
Hopefully that's helpful. So as we kind of pivot for thinking about next week, we thought we'd pose a poll. I think Splendor is going to help us put a poll up because we will have a number of folks joining us next week from the Catalyst 2030 network who will be able to speak very directly about their experience with boards. And we'd love to know from you, what would you like them to kind of double click on in their comments? So I just had a pop up on my window that says panel discussion ideas. Hopefully you all do too. And if you could just tick off however many of these would be most helpful to you, that would be great. Then once you hit submit, I think we'll see some of those results and it'll help us prepare next week's speakers to be sure that we get to some of these ideas and how they're playing out real time for our peers in Catalyst. Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Yep, this is definitely choose all that apply scenario.
And as folks are filling that out, if you're not able to share or you're on your phone, feel free to put in the chat other things that you want the panelists to be discussing next week. You know, creating a productive board, the culture of the board, managing those difficult conversations, maximizing the value of the board. So feel free to add in the chat if you're unable to do the poll. And we're almost up to a good percentage of folks on the poll. I'll give you another 30 seconds. Great. And we will share those results. So you should see those results now.
Great.
And for those other categories, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself and let us know.
Yeah, this is great. So culture, fundraising, and really thinking about that individual value proposition look like the three that are meaningfully ahead of the others, which is great. So really appreciate that.
Great.
We're coming up on time. Debbie, do we want to just make sure folks know who's going to be there next week so you'll have a sense of who it is that will be speaking? We've got writers. Yeah, please.
Sounds good. So our speakers next week, for those of you that are familiar with Catalyst, Laura's going to moderate the session. This will be a dialogue, obviously, between sharing those stories of social entrepreneurs and the challenge you've had on your board yourself, giving some things that have worked and some challenges you faced as well. And we'll all co-create and collaborate and share feedback together. Rana Dajani from We Love Reading. You all know Rana. She's on our board. She is from Jordan, started We Love Reading, is also a professor of biology. Neelam Chibers from industry, and Jacob started that several years ago in India. Huge organization that works with livelihoods, primarily with vulnerable women in the artisan communities. And then Barry Coleman with Writers for Health. He co-founded this with Andrea Coleman. And they've had a lot of challenges with boards as well over the years. And I think the nice thing about this group is they're going to be able to be open and honest with you with some of the challenges and things that they've shared. But we will not be recording that. So if you're not able to attend, try to attend or record or something yourself, but we are not able to record those conversations. So we want to make sure that you know that. And that's next Thursday at 4 p.m. Central Time and 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is a separate login. So you will see in the chat where you can share the login information. Or where you could go ahead and register for that event. And we'll also share that with you in a follow-up email tomorrow, sorry.
Great, and we'd also love your feedback on today's session. Thank you for the kind comments in the chat, but we will also send a feedback form to you all just to collect any other feedback you might have for us. And that'll help us improve for next week, but also give a good sense to Debbie and the team about what's most helpful for you as important members of the Catalyst community.
It was a pleasure being able to speak with everyone today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. We're just about at time. We really look forward to continuing the conversation next week, but thanks for your great questions and examples.
Thank you.
See you next
Thank you
week.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
We appreciate that.
Bye.
Mhm. Great. Thank you again. Have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where in the world you're from. And thank you for registering for that and filling out the survey.
Great. Thanks, Debbie. See you all next
Thank
week.
you.